In the stillness of a house where death has visited, there comes a moment when the living must turn away from their own reflections. Picture an evening in late autumn when the light slants through lace curtains at that peculiar angle between day and dusk. Neither one nor the other, but something suspended. The air holds a quality of waiting. In the parlour, someone drapes black crepe over the mantelpiece mirror, their hands moving with the careful certainty of ritual. The fabric falls like a curtain closing on a stage, and suddenly the room transforms. Where there was once the familiar comfort of your own face looking back, now there is only dark cloth, mysterious and complete. This practice, the covering of mirrors when someone dies, has travelled across oceans and centuries, whispered from grandmother to grandchild, carried in the careful hands of mourners who may not fully understand why they do it, only that it must be done. Some say it protects the dead, others insist it shields the living. But what if the truth is older, stranger, and more beautiful than we remember? What did our ancestors see in mirrors that we have forgotten to notice? But before that, comment down below which country you are watching this video from. Long before glass was silvered and polished to perfect clarity, human beings gazed into still water and wondered at the face that gazed back. The ancient peoples of the world, those who lived closer to mystery than we do now, understood something we have perhaps forgotten. That a reflection is not merely light bouncing off a surface but something more intimate, more vulnerable. They believed they were seeing their soul. In the time of the Romans, 2,000 years before electric lights would banish the shadows from our rooms, mirrors were objects of profound reverence and caution. The Romans held that reflective surfaces served as windows through which the gods themselves could observe the souls of mortals. To break a mirror was not simply careless, it was catastrophic. The soul, they believed, shattered along with the glass, and it would take 7 years to regenerate, for life renewed itself in 7-year cycles, like the slow turning of seasons within seasons. The mirrors of that era were nothing like the ones we know. Polished bronze, burnished copper, sometimes silver or gold. These were the surfaces that caught the firelight in patrician homes. They required constant care, constant attention. A slave might spend hours rubbing and buffing until the metal gleamed. And in that gleam the Romans saw not just their features, but something essential, something divine. When death entered a Roman household, the mirrors were turned to face the wall or covered entirely. The reasons whispered through generations were many and tangled like roots beneath old trees. Some said the departing soul might become confused and try to enter its own reflection rather than journeying onward to the afterlife. Others warned that the mirrors, as conduits to the divine realm, might trap the wandering spirit in an endless liminal space, neither here nor there, caught between the world of matter and the world beyond. There was beauty in this fear, if you look at it from the right angle. It meant that death was not an ending but a passage, and that passage required careful tending. The living had responsibilities to the dead, and those responsibilities included protecting them from getting lost. The belief spread like water finding channels, flowing from culture to culture, changing slightly with each new vessel that contained it. In ancient Greece, where philosophy and mysticism danced together in the agora, mirrors became tools for divination. Catoptromancy, they called it, the art of seeing the future in reflective surfaces. Before the temple of Ceres at Patras, there stood a fountain where the sick would lower a mirror on a thread until it touched the water's surface. After prayers and incense, they would look into the mirror and see their fate. A healthy face meant recovery, a ghastly one foretold death. The Chinese, too, understood mirrors as more than simple objects. 8,000 years ago in Anatolia, people crafted mirrors from black obsidian volcanic glass that held darkness even as it reflected light. They believed their reflection was literally their soul made visible. To break such a mirror was to damage the soul itself, a wound that might never fully heal. But there was another Chinese belief, darker and more unsettling. According to ancient mythology recorded by the writer Jorge Luis Borges, the reflections in mirrors were not reflections at all, but another species entirely, creatures that mimicked human movements, learning our ways, biding their time. In the year 2690, before the Common Era, during the reign of the Yellow Emperor, these mirror creatures launched an invasion. They emerged from every reflective surface, devouring thousands of humans and taking their places in the world. The Emperor, through powerful magic, managed to trap them back inside the mirrors, binding them to sleep. But the legend warns that they are only sleeping, and the strange movements we sometimes catch in mirrors from the corners of our eyes are the first stirrings of their awakening. It sounds like fantasy, like the sort of story told to frighten children. Yet it speaks to something we still feel, even now, the uncanny quality of seeing ourselves. How the mirror you moves when you move, watches when you watch, but remains somehow separate, somehow other. That small frisson of strangeness when you meet your own eyes in a darkened bathroom at 3 a.m. The Egyptians placed mirrors in burial tombs, believing they would serve as portals to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. The Book of the Dead describes rituals where the newly departed would use mirrors to reunite with their mortal soul by gazing upon their own reflection one final time before the journey to the field of reeds. In life, mirrors were tools of vanity and grooming. In death, they became something sacred, gateways between worlds, instruments of transformation. Across all these ancient cultures, a pattern emerges, like a watermark held up to light. The mirror was never just a mirror. It was a threshold. It was dangerous. It required respect and careful handling, especially in the presence of death, when the boundaries between this world and the next grew thin as spider silk. And so the practice began, in ways we can trace, and in ways now lost to time. When death visited a household, the mirrors must be covered. The dead must be protected from their own reflections. Or perhaps, and this is where the belief grows more complex, the living must be protected from what they might see looking back. The 19th century wrapped death in black crepe and elaborate ceremony, turning grief into a public performance that lasted for years. In Victorian England and America, when someone died, the entire world had to know. The house itself became a stage for mourning, and every detail mattered, from the black-bordered stationery to the jet jewellery worn by widows, from the stopped clocks to the draped mirrors. Queen Victoria set the tone for an entire era. When Prince Albert died of typhoid fever in 1861, she plunged into mourning and never truly emerged. For 40 years, until her own death in 1901, she wore black. Her grief became a template, a standard against which all other mourning was measured. If the Queen could mourn for decades, surely her subjects could manage at least 2.5 years for a spouse, 1 year for a parent, 6 months for a sibling. The Victorians made an industry of death. Mourning warehouses sold everything a grieving family might need. Black bombazine fabric that didn't show wear, special mourning handkerchiefs with black borders, calling cards edged in increasingly narrow bands of black as the mourning period progressed. There were rules for everything, what you could wear, where you could go, whom you could see. A widow in full mourning was essentially removed from society, hidden away like a ghost of herself, and in these houses of mourning the mirrors were covered. When Abraham Lincoln's body lay in state in the East Room of the White House, witnesses described how the mirrors between the windows were draped with heavy blackerage, the gilded frames entirely enshrouded. The plates of glass were covered with white crepe. Even the paintings were treated with mourning respect. The railroad magnate Charles Crocker's family turned all the paintings in his San Francisco mansion to face the wall when he died in 1888. The moment death was confirmed, a flurry of activity began. Someone would draw all the curtains, plunging the rooms into premature twilight even if the sun blazed outside. Clocks were stopped at the exact moment of death, frozen in time, marking the instant when one soul departed this world. A wreath of laurel or yew tied with black ribbons would be hung on the front door to alert passers-by that death had visited this address. Then came the mirrors. Family members or servants would move through the house with lengths of black crepe or white cloth covering every reflective surface. The mirror over the mantelpiece in the parlour, the looking glass in the entrance hall, the dressing table mirrors in the bedrooms. Even small hand mirrors were turned face down or wrapped in fabric. The house, already dimmed by drawn curtains, became a place where you could not see yourself, could not check your appearance, could not catch your own eye in passing. The reasons given were many, and they tangled together like the black veils widows wore over their faces. Some Victorians said it was to prevent the deceased's spirit from becoming trapped in the mirror, unable to journey to heaven. The soul, newly freed from the body, might wander confused through the familiar rooms of home and seeing its reflection become imprisoned in that flat world behind the glass, forever caught, forever separate from the afterlife it was meant to enter. Others believed that if a living person saw their own reflection in a room where someone had recently died, they would be the next to perish. Death was contagious in this way, spreading through the household like an illness, and mirrors were the vector. Your own face, reflected in the presence of death, became an omen of your impending doom. There was also the matter of vanity. The Victorians, for all their elaborate mourning rituals, understood that grief and self-regard were incompatible. To mourn properly meant to turn inward, to focus entirely on the loss and the deceased. The mirror invited you to think about your appearance, to adjust your hair, to notice how the mourning dress fit your figure. Better to remove the temptation entirely. Better to live for a time without seeing yourself at all. But beneath these explanations lurked something older and more primal. The Victorians were deeply superstitious, even as they lived through an age of scientific advancement and industrial progress. They believed in ghosts and spirits, in omens and portents. They held seances and visited mediums. They photographed their dead children posed as if sleeping, eyes painted onto closed lids to create the illusion of life. Death fascinated and terrified them in equal measure. In parts of Germany and Belgium, the custom predated Victorian England by centuries. There, mirrors were covered with white cloths because people believed that seeing your reflection after a death in the household meant you would die shortly yourself. The belief was specific, urgent. If you glimpse your face in the mirror, death will come for you before the month is out. A survey of North Carolina customs from 1964 captured the beautiful chaos of these overlapping beliefs. Mirrors must be covered, people said, because whoever looks into the mirror will be seriously sick during the year. Or, because if you see a corpse's picture in the mirror, there will be another death in the same house within a month. Or because the soul of the dead person wanders for 3 days and must not see itself. If it does, the mirrors will tarnish and never be clean again. Or in days to come, the mirror will turn and make a picture of the dead. Sometimes, as the Scottish Reverend George Lowe discovered when visiting the Orkney Islands in 1773, people simply didn't know why they did it. Questioning locals about why they locked up all the cats and covered all the looking glasses when someone died, he confessed in his notes, "I know not for what reason they do this, nor can they give any satisfactory account of it. The tradition had become instinct, muscle memory, something done because your mother did it and her mother before her. The why had faded, but the practice remained, stubborn and enduring as ivy on a cemetery wall. For the wealthy Victorians, the funeral itself became an opportunity to display status and respect through elaborate expenditure. Professional mourners could be hired, mutes who would stand in solemn silence, or wailers who would cry and wail dramatically by the graveside. The more you spent, the more you cared, or so the thinking went. A working-class funeral might cost £5 when a yearly salary was only 20. Families saved for years or paid into funeral funds to ensure they could afford a proper send-off. And through it all, through the weeks of the wake when the body lay in the parlour, through the funeral procession with its black horses and black plumes, through the months and years of prescribed mourning that followed, the mirror stayed covered. The house remained a place of dimness and reflection denied, a space where the living moved like shadows and the dead were everywhere present in their absence. The Victorians believed they were being respectful, honouring the deceased, protecting the vulnerable soul in its journey, but they were also, whether they knew it or not, continuing something far older, a practice that stretched back through centuries, through cultures, through the accumulated wisdom and fear of countless generations who understood that mirrors and death should not mix. In the 21st century, we look back at Victorian mourning customs and find them excessive, even morbid. We prefer our grief private, our funerals brief, our return to normal life swift. We no longer drape our houses in black or stop our clocks or cover our mirrors. But perhaps they understood something we have forgotten. Perhaps they knew that grief requires ritual, that death deserves ceremony, that the passage from life to death to memory needs marking in ways that transform the physical world around us. The covered mirror was not just superstition. It was a way of saying, everything has changed. Even the way we see ourselves must change. In Jewish tradition, when someone dies, time reorganizes itself around loss. For 7 days, Shiva, the Hebrew word for 7, the mourners sit low to the ground, receive visitors, and exist in a space deliberately separated from ordinary life. And in that space the mirrors are covered. This practice continues today, carried forward through millennia, still observed in Jewish homes from New York to Jerusalem, from Buenos Aires to Sydney. Walk into a Shiva house and you will see them, sheets draped over bathroom mirrors, towels thrown across bedroom dressing tables, fabric pinned over the mirror in the entrance hall. The house looks strange, deliberately altered, as if grief has rearranged the furniture of reality itself. But ask why the mirrors are covered, and you will receive not one answer but many, each one true in its own way, each one revealing a different facet of an ancient understanding. The most common explanation speaks to vanity and focus. During Shiva, mourners do not cut their hair, do not shave, do not apply makeup or concern themselves with their appearance. This is a time to turn inward, to concentrate on the person who has died and what their life meant. The mirror invites distraction. It asks you to notice your unwashed hair, your tired eyes, the way grief has marked your face. Better to remove the invitation entirely. Better to spend these 7 days thinking about the deceased rather than your own reflection. There is a practical element too. Prayer services are often held in the house of mourning, and Jewish law clearly states that one must not pray before a mirror. The reasons are twofold. First, the mirror breaks concentration, pulling your attention away from prayer and toward your own image. Second, and more profound, it may appear that you are bowing to yourself rather than to God. During mourning, when humility before divine will is essential, this appearance of self-worship becomes especially inappropriate. Some scholars point to an older custom, no longer widely practiced, of overturning beds in the house of mourning. The marital bed, they explain, is the facilitator of new life, and in the presence of death it must be overturned as a sign that normal relations are suspended. The covered mirrors serve a similar function. Both act as reminders that intimate relations are forbidden during Shiva, and mirrors are expressions of vanity that should not be used when mourning. But then there are the other reasons, the ones that speak to spirits and shadows. The Kabbalists, those Jewish mystics who sought the hidden meanings beneath the surface of Torah, offered an explanation that sends shivers down the spine even now. They taught that when a soul leaves this world, it creates a void, an emptiness, and wherever there is emptiness, negative forces can enter. The house of mourning becomes a magnet for these dark energies, spirits and demons drawn to grief like moths to flame. These entities cannot be seen with the naked eye, but, and here is where the teaching grows eerie, when looking in a mirror you might catch a glimpse of their reflections in the background. The Zohar, that central text of Kabbalah, warns that looking in mirrors too much leads to arrogance and gives power to evil spirits. Rabbi Yonatan Eibschotz, writing in the 18th century, went further. Every graven image has an impure spiritual force attached to it, and mirrors are especially dangerous because spirits can enter the reflection itself. Therefore, the reasoning goes, mirrors must be covered during Shiva because evil spirits are commonly found in homes where death has occurred. During this vulnerable time, these spirits can more easily attach themselves to reflections. The covering protects the mourners from seeing what should not be seen, from giving power to forces that feed on grief and loss. One explanation, quieter but no less poignant, suggests that the mirrors are covered to spare the deceased confusion. Imagine the newly departed soul still lingering near its loved ones, still attached to the familiar spaces of home. It sees everyone gathered, sees their faces in the mirror, but not its own. The shock of that absence, that first confirmation of no longer existing in the physical world, could trap the soul in distress, unable to move forward to whatever comes next. In the comments sections of websites where rabbis explain these customs, you find testimonies that blur the line between superstition and experience. A woman writes that on the day of her grandmother's funeral, a sliding glass door shattered without anyone touching it, without any visible cause. Police found no projectile, no explanation. A few years later, when her uncle died, a china cabinet he had given the family spontaneously cracked and collapsed. The tradition of covering glass after a death may have its origins in such occurrences, she suggests. Her words careful, neither fully believing nor fully dismissing. Another person describes witnessing an uncovered mirror break on the day of burial, the glass fracturing as if from invisible pressure. There are forces at work in our world that are not understood, someone responds. Hashem does not show us everything he does. It is not intended for us to understand everything that happens. This multiplicity of meanings is itself instructive. Judaism has always been a religion of interpretation, of argument and discussion, of multiple truths existing simultaneously. The Talmud records disputes between great scholars, preserving both opinions even when they contradict. So too with the covered mirrors. They can be about vanity and about spirits, about prayer and about protection, about focusing inward and about warding off external forces. What seems certain is that Jews did not invent this practice but adopted it from their neighbours. References to covered or overturned mirrors appear in cultures far removed from ancient Israel, suggesting that this is a folk belief that predates its incorporation into Jewish law. Rabbis, encountering this widespread custom among the Jewish communities they served, gradually gave it religious meaning, codified it, wove it into the fabric of mourning tradition. This happened often in Jewish history, the absorption of local customs, their transformation through religious interpretation into something both ancient and new. The mirrors in a Shiva house connect modern mourners to Talmudic scholars debating in Babylonian academies, to medieval mystics seeking hidden wisdom, to Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms, to survivors of the Holocaust rebuilding tradition from ashes. But they also connect to something older than Judaism itself, to that original human intuition that mirrors and death are an uneasy pairing, that the threshold between worlds grows thin in the presence of dying, that reflections hold something more than mere images. In Ireland, Catholics adopted the practice, turning mirrors to face the wall during wakes. In Russia, Orthodox Christians covered mirrors with black cloth to ease the deceased's journey into the afterlife. The custom spread like an underground river, surfacing in different cultures, different faiths, carrying the same essential message. When death visits, the mirrors must be hidden. A modern Shiva house is a study in contrasts. There are ancient prayers in Hebrew, songs sung in Yiddish or Ladino. There are also platters of deli sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, people checking their phones during breaks in the service. The low benches might be provided by the funeral home, practical stackable seats that come in a Shiva kit, along with prayer books and memorial candles. The mirrors might be covered with bed sheets from Target secured with painter's tape, yet for all the modern trappings, something timeless persists. The house still feels transformed, set apart. The covered mirrors still create that sense of dislocation, of being in familiar space made strange. And the mourners still sit, still receive visitors, still say Kaddish, that prayer which mentions everything except death, which praises God and sanctifies the divine name, which asserts faith even in the midst of unbearable loss. The mirrors will stay covered for the full 7 days. On the morning after Shiva ends, someone will walk through the house, removing the sheets, the towels, the fabric. The mourners will look at themselves again, will wash their faces, comb their hair, rejoin the world of normal concerns and vanities. But they will be changed, as everyone is changed by grief and the rituals that hold it. And they will remember, perhaps, those 7 days when the mirrors were dark, when the house was full of visitors and prayers and stories about the deceased, when time moved differently and the boundary between this world and the next seemed almost permeable, almost crossable, like a veil you could reach through if you only knew how. In Chinese culture, mirrors hold power that flows both ways. They can ward off evil or invite misfortune, protect the living or trap the dead. The line between blessing and curse is as thin as the silvered backing on glass. When death comes to a traditional Chinese household, the response is immediate and specific. All the mirrors in the home must be removed or covered, not draped with respectful black cloth as the Victorians did, but taken down entirely, turned to face the wall, hidden away where no reflection can form. The statues of household deities, those small figures that watch over the family from their places of honor, must be covered too, veiled with red paper so they are not exposed to the pollution of death, so they are not offended by its presence. The reason, spoken in hushed tones by those who remember the old ways, is this: if anyone sees the reflection of a coffin in a mirror, death will soon visit that person's family. The mirror becomes a conduit, a transmitter of misfortune. The reflected coffin carries a curse that cannot be undone by any amount of prayer or protective ritual. This is not metaphor or gentle symbolism. In traditional Chinese belief, the reflected image of death actively causes more death. To see it is to invite it. To allow a mirror to remain uncovered in a house with a body is to gamble with the lives of everyone who might glance into that reflective surface and glimpse, even peripherally, the casket in the background. Chinese funeral customs are intricate, varying by region and family tradition, but certain elements persist across the diaspora. When someone is dying, when the breath grows shallow and the end approaches, those who can afford it bring the person home from the hospital. Better to die surrounded by family and familiar rooms than in the sterile fluorescence of medical institutions. The moment of death should happen, if possible, where the soul knows its way, and then the preparations begin. A white cloth is hung across the main entrance, white being the colour of mourning, of purity, of the unknown. A gong is placed by the door, on the left side if the deceased was male, on the right if female. Neighbours, seeing the white banner, place small pieces of red cloth on their own doors, marking the way to the house of death, guiding visitors through the maze of similar buildings and narrow streets. Inside, someone has already covered the mirrors. Someone has already veiled the gods in red paper, asking them to look away, to grant the family privacy in its grief. The living room is cleared of furniture and transformed into a temporary temple for the dead. Incense burns in holders, its smoke rising in thin grey columns. Offerings of food are arranged on tables. Fruit, rice, dishes the deceased enjoyed in life. Before the body is placed in the coffin, it is washed with a damp towel, dusted with talcum powder, dressed in the finest clothes from the deceased's own wardrobe. Red clothing is avoided. Red is for joy, for weddings, for celebration. To bury someone in red might cause them to become a ghost, eternally restless. A mirror and a bag of grain are placed inside the coffin. Provisions for the journey. The mirror to light the way through darkness. The grain to ensure the deceased will never hunger in the afterworld. The wake can last from 3 to 7 days, always an odd number, even numbers being unlucky, associated with yin and death in ways that even numbers are not. During this time, the family receives visitors, accepts gifts of incense and paper money, maintains constant vigil over the body. In some regions, professional wailers are hired, women whose job is to cry with appropriate volume and grief. The louder the wailing, the greater the respect shown to the deceased. And if the deceased left behind substantial wealth, the wailing grows particularly dramatic. Throughout all of this, the mirrors remain hidden. The belief about mirrors trapping spirits extends beyond funerals. In feng shui, that ancient art of harmonizing energy flow, mirrors are powerful tools but dangerous if misused. A mirror in a bedroom facing the bed is considered inauspicious. While you sleep, the teaching goes, your spirit leaves your body to wander and restore itself. If that spirit sees its own reflection upon returning, it might become confused and try to enter the body in the mirror instead of the actual body. This confusion creates an opening, an opportunity for malevolent forces to slip into the unguarded flesh. It sounds like superstition, like the sort of belief that modern education should have erased. Yet in Chinese communities throughout the world, in Singapore and San Francisco, in Vancouver and Melbourne, people still avoid placing mirrors opposite their beds, still cover them or remove them when death visits, still teach their children to be cautious around reflective surfaces during vulnerable times. There is also the matter of the number 4. In Mandarin, the word for 4, si, sounds nearly identical to the word for death, si. This homophonic coincidence has shaped everything from building design to phone numbers. Many buildings have no 4th floor, the elevator buttons jumping from 3 to 5, car license plates avoid the number 4, house addresses skip it when possible, and mirrors, already associated with spiritual matters, become especially dangerous when linked to this unlucky number. The old legends speak of the Mirror Kingdom, a realm parallel to our own where creatures sleep under an ancient spell. These beings once mimicked humans perfectly, learning our ways, studying our weaknesses. Then they attacked, emerging from every mirror in a coordinated invasion. Only powerful magic subdued them, binding them to sleep within the glass. But they are merely sleeping, the legends warn. The strange movements we sometimes perceive in mirrors, seen from the corner of our eyes, are the first signs of their awakening. Whether anyone truly believes this myth is harder to say. It persists in the way folk tales do, half remembered, half dismissed, yet somehow influential in the architecture of belief that shapes daily life. You might not think you believe that mirror creatures are waiting to invade, but you might still feel uneasy about a mirror positioned at the foot of your bed, catching your reflection as you sleep. After the burial, after the funeral procession with its hired musicians and its route carefully chosen to confuse any ghosts that might try to follow the living back home, the family enters a period of formal mourning, 100 days of restraint, of wearing coloured armbands that indicate their relationship to the deceased, black for children, blue for grandchildren, green for great-grandchildren. Special offerings are made every 7 days, or in some traditions every day for 49 days. Food placed outside for the soul to consume. Paper money burned so the deceased can bribe the officials of the underworld for a better afterlife. During this time, the mirrors gradually return. The house resumes its normal appearance. Life, which paused for death, begins again its familiar patterns. But something has been learned, something has been observed, that death requires transformation of space, that grief needs visible markers, that the spirit world and the material world intersect in ways we only partially understand. Chinese immigrants carried these beliefs to new countries where they mingled with local customs and adapted to new circumstances. In America, A Chinese-American family might observe some traditions and not others, cover the mirrors but skip the professional wailers, burn paper money but have a church service. The beliefs flex and change like living things, which perhaps they are. An elderly woman in San Francisco might still refuse to have a mirror facing her bed, though she couldn't fully articulate why if asked. A young professional in Hong Kong might dismiss the superstitions intellectually but still feel a tremor of unease at the thought of keeping an uncovered mirror in a room with a body. The belief persists not through conscious choice but through that deeper knowing that lives in the body, in the half-remembered warnings of grandmothers, in the residue of centuries of practice. Perhaps there is something about mirrors and death that remains true across cultures and time periods, something that our ancestors understood intuitively even if they explained it through the language of spirits and souls and supernatural forces. The mirror shows us ourselves, but when death is present, the self becomes uncertain. Am I the mourner, or will I be the mourned? Am I living or dying? Where is the boundary? The covered mirror acknowledges this uncertainty, this liminality. It says, "For now we do not look. For now we turn our faces away from our own images and toward the mystery of what comes next." In the American South, where the past sits heavy in the humid air and Spanish moss hangs like memory from live oak trees, the tradition of covering mirrors when someone died wove itself into the fabric of daily life, mixing African beliefs with European superstitions, Native American wisdom with Caribbean spirituality, creating something entirely new yet ancient at its core. The practice arrived on slave ships carried in the minds of people who had been stripped of everything but their beliefs. West African traditions about spirits and the dead, about the thin places where worlds overlap, survived the Middle Passage and took root in new soil. They mingled with the folk beliefs of Scottish and Irish immigrants, with the mysticism of French and Spanish settlers, with the indigenous knowledge of the land itself. What emerged was a rich tradition of protective magic, of reading signs, of respecting forces both seen and unseen. In the Gullah Geechee communities along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, descendants of enslaved Africans maintained practices that would have been familiar to their ancestors. When death came to a household, the mirrors were covered immediately, not just to protect the dead, but to protect the living from haints. Haints. The word itself sounds like wind through a cracked window, like breath escaping. These were spirits trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead, angry, confused, desperate to return to the warmth of embodied life. They might be the recently deceased, not yet reconciled to their new state. They might be older spirits, malevolent entities that fed on grief and fear. Either way, they were dangerous. The belief held that spirits cannot cross water. This is why southern homes, particularly in the Gullah tradition, often sport porch ceilings painted in a distinctive blue-green shade called haint blue. The colour mimics water, confusing the spirits, making them believe they cannot enter. To this day, you can drive through the low country and see porch after porch painted in this protective shade. Some homeowners knowing the history, others just thinking it looks nice, unaware they are continuing a tradition of spiritual defense that stretches back centuries. But mirrors were another entry point, another threshold. A haint could slip through a mirror as easily as through a door, could reach from the spirit world into the material one through that reflective surface. When someone died, when the veil between worlds grew gossamer thin, the mirrors had to be covered to prevent spirits from using them as gateways. There were other reasons too, other warnings passed down through generations. If you saw your own reflection in a room where someone had recently died, your own death would come prematurely. The mirror would somehow mark you, claim you, pull you toward the grave. Better not to look. Better to drape every mirror in cloth and wait until the body had been buried, until the soul had moved on, until the danger passed. In New Orleans, where Vodou practices blended with Catholicism and created something uniquely powerful, the mirror beliefs took on additional layers. Covering mirrors in a house of mourning was seen as protection against vampirism, for one of the many ways a person could be transformed into a vampire, according to Louisiana folklore, was if a dead body was reflected in a mirror. The reflection somehow transferred the curse, trapped the soul in its corpse, forced it to rise at night seeking blood. Absurd? Perhaps, but the people who covered their mirrors believed, and their belief shaped their actions, and their actions created safety, whether magical or merely psychological. The southern tradition of the wake meant that bodies were never left unattended from the moment of death until the moment of burial. Family members would sit up through the night with the deceased, both out of respect and out of vigilance. This was partly practical. Before modern embalming, you wanted to be certain the person was truly dead and not in some comatose state. But it was also spiritual protection, ensuring no dark forces could interfere with the body, no haint could slip inside the empty vessel and animate it for terrible purposes. During these vigils, with the mirrors covered and the candles burning, people told stories. They shared memories of the deceased, recounted their virtues, their quirks, the moments that defined them. But they also told other stories about signs and portents, about the strange things that happen when death is near. A bird flying into the house meant death was coming. 3 knocks at the door with no one there. Death was announcing itself. A picture falling from the wall for no reason. Someone would die. An owl following you as you walked home through the darkness. You had been marked. The smell of roses when there were no roses in the house. Death was already present, invisible but near. These beliefs sound like superstition to modern ears, like the anxieties of people who didn't understand the natural world, who attributed meaning to coincidence. But there was a deeper pattern at work. These signs, these portents, these protective rituals, they gave people a sense of agency in the face of death's randomness. If you knew the signs, you could prepare. If you followed the rituals, you could protect yourself and your family. If you covered the mirrors, you could prevent additional tragedies from cascading through your household. The tradition persisted long after slavery ended, long after African Americans gained their freedom and began building new lives. It spread beyond the black community into white Southern culture, becoming just the way things were done without anyone quite remembering why. A grandmother in Mississippi in the 1950s would cover the mirrors when her husband died because her grandmother had done it, and her grandmother before that. The chain of tradition unbroken even as the reasons faded into the soft focus of history. In the movie Fried Green Tomatoes, set in Alabama, there is a scene that Southern audiences recognize instantly. When Ruth dies, the family's black maid immediately begins moving through the house, covering mirrors and stopping clocks. She does this without being asked, without explanation. It is simply what must be done. The movie doesn't explain the custom. It trusts that some viewers will know, will recognize this moment as authentic to Southern death rituals, will feel the rightness of it. The clock stopping is related but distinct from the mirror covering. Stopping all the clocks in the house at the moment of death serves multiple purposes. It marks the exact time for the death certificate, yes, but it also symbolically freezes time, acknowledging that time has stopped for the deceased. Some believe that if the clocks kept running, the ticking would invite the dead to linger, to remain caught in the flow of the living's time, rather than moving on to whatever timeless realm awaited. Before the funeral, before the clocks were restarted, the deceased existed in a kind of temporal suspension. The house became a place outside normal time where past and present overlapped, where the dead and the living shared space in an uneasy intimacy. The covered mirrors reinforced this sense of otherworldliness, this feeling that the normal rules had been suspended. Some Southern families had additional customs around mirrors and death. In certain communities, if a soul was believed to be trapped in the mirror world, you could release it by breaking the mirror, shattering the glass to shatter the prison. Of course, this invited the 7 years of bad luck associated with broken mirrors. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Better to risk bad luck than to leave a loved one's soul trapped in eternal silvered captivity. During thunderstorms, some families covered their mirrors to keep souls from coming through during the electrical chaos. When the barrier between worlds grew particularly unstable, lightning and mirrors were a dangerous combination. The flash and the reflection together could open doorways that should remain closed. There were regional variations, family variations, individual variations. One household might cover mirrors for 3 days, another for a week, another until after the funeral. Some used black cloth, some white, some whatever was available. Some turned the mirrors to face the wall instead of covering them. Some removed the mirrors from the house entirely, storing them in sheds or barns until the mourning period concluded. But the core belief remained consistent. Mirrors and death were a dangerous combination, and the wise took precautions. This wasn't ignorance or primitive thinking. This was a sophisticated understanding that death creates vulnerability, that grief opens us to influences both psychological and spiritual, that ritual and practice can help us navigate the most difficult transitions life demands of us. The tradition has faded now, even in the South. Modern funeral homes handle the body, removing it quickly from the home. The dead rarely lie in state in parlours anymore. Wakes are brief, professional affairs held at the funeral home's chapel. Mirrors remain uncovered, clocks keep running, and most people under the age of 60 have never seen the old customs performed. But in some places, in some families, the knowledge persists. A great aunt who still covers mirrors when death visits. A grandmother who stops the clocks and can explain, if asked, that it's to let the spirit know it's time to go, that we're honouring them but also releasing them. These practices survive in pockets, kept alive by people who remember, who believe, or who simply feel that some old ways deserve preservation even if we no longer fully understand them. And on those haint blue porches where families gather on summer evenings to escape the heat and tell stories, sometimes the old tales surface. Someone mentions covering mirrors. Someone else remembers a time when glass spontaneously shattered on the day of a funeral. Another person describes seeing something in a mirror once. Just a shadow, just a movement that shouldn't have been there. The stories circle and accumulate, neither fully believed nor fully dismissed, existing in that liminal space between history and myth, between fact and faith. There is something about the act itself, the physical gesture of covering a mirror, that transcends any single explanation. The hand reaching up with cloth, the reflection disappearing beneath fabric, the room suddenly changed. It is a small act that marks enormous transformation. Consider what it means to cover a mirror. You are removing your own image from your environment. You are creating a space where you cannot see yourself, cannot check your appearance, cannot catch your own eye in passing. For the duration of mourning, you exist without visual confirmation of your existence. This is stranger than it might initially seem. We are so accustomed to mirrors, to seeing ourselves dozens of times each day, in bathroom mirrors as we brush our teeth, in car mirrors as we drive, in shop windows as we pass, in the black screens of our phones before we wake them. We know our faces as well as we know anything. We rely on our reflection to assure us that we are presentable, appropriate, recognizable. To suddenly remove all mirrors is to remove this constant confirmation. You move through your house and there are only blank spaces where your face should appear. You wash your hands and cannot see yourself in the bathroom mirror. You stand in the hallway and the mirror that usually greets you shows only dark cloth. You exist, but you cannot see yourself existing. Perhaps this is precisely the point. In grief, we become uncertain of who we are, the person we were before the death. Before we became a widow, an orphan, someone who has lost a child, that person no longer exists. But the person we are becoming, the one who must learn to live with this absence, has not yet fully formed. We are in transition, in transformation. The covered mirror acknowledges this in-between state. The psychologist Jacques Lacan wrote about the mirror stage of childhood development, that moment when a baby first recognizes its own reflection and understands, that is me. It is a foundational moment in the development of self-consciousness, of ego, of identity. The mirror helps us construct our sense of self, shapes how we understand our place in the world. But what happens when we cannot see ourselves? When the mirrors are covered and we move through the world without that constant visual feedback? Perhaps we are forced to locate our identity elsewhere, not in our physical appearance, but in our relationships, our memories, our connection to the person who died. Perhaps the covered mirror is an invitation to find ourselves in something deeper than reflected light. In many cultures, the immediate aftermath of death involves a withdrawal from normal social life. Jewish mourners sit shiva, remaining at home for 7 days. Victorian widows entered seclusion, avoiding social engagements for months or years. Chinese families observed 100-day mourning periods. These practices all share a common thread. Grief requires separation, requires a time apart from the ordinary world. The covered mirror reinforces this separation. It makes the familiar strange, transforms the everyday environment into something other. You are still in your own home, but it is not quite your home anymore. The mirrors, those fixtures so ordinary you barely notice them, become uncanny in their absence. The house itself becomes liminal, neither fully the world of the living nor the world of the dead, but a threshold space where both realities coexist. Anthropologists studying death rituals across cultures note that almost all societies have transition periods after a death, times when the normal rules are suspended, when special practices must be observed. These liminal periods serve multiple functions. They give the dead time to journey to the afterlife. They give the living time to adjust to the absence. They mark the significance of what has occurred. The covered mirror is a perfect symbol of liminality. A mirror is already a threshold, a boundary between the physical world and the world of reflection. To cover it is to close that boundary, to acknowledge that during this time of transition certain doorways should remain shut. In some traditions, the mourners themselves undergo physical transformation during the mourning period. Jewish mourners tear their clothing in the ritual of Kariah, creating a visible sign of rupture and loss. They sit on low benches closer to the ground, physically lowering themselves. They do not wear leather shoes, leather being a luxury, a comfort, something associated with normal life rather than grief. All of these practices share a common purpose. They make grief visible, they embody it, they give it physical form. The covered mirror does the same. Anyone entering a house where the mirrors are draped knows immediately death has visited here. Something fundamental has changed. The normal courtesies and expectations do not apply. There is also something democratic about the covered mirror. Rich and poor alike have faces. Wealthy homes might have gilded mirrors in ornate frames, while humble homes have simple-looking glasses, but everyone has some reflective surface, and everyone can cover it. The practice does not require special materials or expensive ritual objects. A bedsheet will do. A towel, a piece of dark fabric. Grief is a great equalizer, and the covered mirror reflects this, no pun intended. But perhaps the most profound aspect of covering mirrors is what it says about vanity and mortality. To care about one's appearance is human, natural, even healthy in normal times. We want to look presentable, to be attractive, to make a good impression. Mirrors serve this desire, help us achieve it. But in the face of death, vanity becomes absurd. What does it matter how our hair looks when someone we love is gone? What significance does our appearance hold when confronted with the absolute transformation of death? The covered mirror says, for now, these concerns are meaningless. For now, we focus on what actually matters: love, memory, loss, the great mystery of where the dead go when they leave us. This is not to say that grief should be ugly or unkempt. Rather, it is an acknowledgement that during the first raw days after a death, the ordinary concerns of daily life pale into insignificance. The covered mirror gives permission to stop performing, to stop maintaining the facade, to simply be in the rawness of grief without worrying about how one looks while grieving. In Victorian England, this was codified into strict rules. No jewellery except jet, no colours except black, veils to hide the face. The covered mirrors fit into this larger system of removing oneself from the gaze of others, from the concern with appearance and social presentation. Modern grief tends to be more private, less performative, but the impulse remains the same. There is something inappropriate about vanity in the presence of death. Some psychological benefits to covering mirrors during mourning have been suggested by modern researchers. When depressed or grieving, people sometimes experience intrusive negative thoughts when seeing their reflection, criticism of their appearance, rumination about aging and mortality, distressing awareness of how grief has marked their face. Removing mirrors removes these triggers, creates a gentler environment for healing. There is also the phenomenon of the strange face in the mirror illusion, a psychological effect where staring at your own reflection in dim light can cause your face to appear distorted, monstrous, or replaced by the face of someone else. This happens due to a combination of sensory deprivation and the brain's pattern recognition systems misfiring. During the vulnerable, exhausted state of early grief, such illusions could be particularly distressing. Better perhaps to cover the mirrors and avoid the possibility entirely. Yet even these modern psychological explanations do not fully account for the power of the practice. There is something that remains unexplained, something that persists in the space between rational understanding and felt experience. People who have covered mirrors after a death often report that it felt right, that the house needed this transformation, that the ritual served some purpose beyond what they could articulate. Maybe this is because rituals speak to parts of us that exist below the level of language, below the level of conscious thought. They engage the body, the senses, the ancient parts of the brain that think in symbols and patterns rather than words. The covered mirror is such a symbol, powerful, multivalent, speaking simultaneously to conscious concerns about vanity and unconscious anxieties about death, souls, boundaries, and transformation. It says, we are in a different time now. We are in a different space. The normal rules do not apply. We cannot see ourselves because we are not fully ourselves. We are in the process of becoming different, of incorporating this loss into our identity. of learning to live in a world where someone we loved no longer exists in physical form. The mirror will be uncovered eventually. Life will return to its patterns. But for now, for these days or weeks of mourning, we exist in the darkness behind the cloth, in the space where reflection cannot reach, where we are free to grieve without watching ourselves grieve, to transform without witnessing our own transformation. There must come a moment when the mirrors are uncovered. After the prescribed days of mourning, after the funeral, after the initial shock has settled into something more permanent and enduring, someone walks through the house and removes the fabric. The mirrors are revealed again, cleaned of any dust that settled during their covering, and the house returns to something resembling normalcy. But what is it like? That first glimpse of yourself, after days of not seeing your reflection. A woman in Italy writes about covering mirrors when her grandfather died in the year 2000. She was young, confused when her aunt insisted they drape every mirror in the house with dark towels and sheets. At the time it seemed strange, almost superstitious. But years later she remembers it as one of the most powerful experiences of her grief. The way the house felt transformed, the way the absence of mirrors created a kind of sacred space where mourning could happen without self-consciousness. When her aunt died 3 years later in a hospital, there were no mirrors to cover. The aunt had said she had no regrets, that she was going in peace. Standing at her bedside, the writer began to believe in the soul, not as something that might be trapped in a mirror, but as something visible in the looks of those who are with us, in their words, in all the gestures through which human beings communicate with one another. This is what the tradition teaches, perhaps, when it is followed with attention, that the soul is not just our reflection, not just our physical appearance, but something more, something that exists in connection, in relationship, in the spaces between people. In Ireland, where Catholic wakes still sometimes include the covering of mirrors, an old woman comments online about how the tradition bothered her as a child. Of all the Irish customs she grew up with, and there were many, this was the one that unsettled her most. Something about the draped mirrors felt eerie, made death too present, too real. Her husband, raised without these traditions, thinks they're all crazy, but she cannot quite dismiss them, cannot quite shake the feeling that they serve some purpose, even if she doesn't fully understand what. The testimonies scatter across the internet like leaves, appearing in comment sections and forum discussions, in personal essays and family history websites. Someone mentions that their Chinese grandmother always covered mirrors during wakes, that it was just part of how things were done. Someone else describes a glass door shattering on the day of their great-grandmother's funeral, no cause ever found, and wonders if the old beliefs about covering glass had origins in such inexplicable events. A rabbi explains the Kabbalistic teaching about evil spirits, and someone responds, "This scares me. Does this mean we can physically see demons in the mirror during Shiva?" The rabbi's answer is gentle but doesn't quite resolve the question. "There are forces at work in our world that are not understood," someone else comments. "We are not meant to understand everything that happens." This is the space where the tradition lives now, in uncertainty, in the gap between belief and skepticism, in the acknowledgement that some things remain mysterious even in our age of scientific explanation. Most people in the 21st century do not literally believe that souls can be trapped in mirrors or that demons become visible in reflections. But many still feel that something about mirrors and death is uncomfortable, that there is a rightness to covering them, that the old practices contain wisdom even if we translate that wisdom into different terms. A young Jewish woman describes sitting Shiva for her father, how strange it felt to not see herself for 7 days, how by the end of the week she had almost forgotten what she looked like. When the mirrors were uncovered, she barely recognized herself, not because her appearance had changed dramatically, but because her sense of self had shifted. She was no longer someone with a living father. She was someone who had lost her father. The reflection showed the same face, but the person looking out through those eyes was different. This transformation is what mourning accomplishes, what the rituals facilitate. The covered mirror creates a cocoon, a protected space where metamorphosis can occur. When the mirrors are revealed again, we emerge changed, not healed, perhaps not even accepting, but different. Marked, initiated into the community of those who have experienced significant loss. In Russia, where Orthodox tradition still sometimes includes covering mirrors with black cloth, the practice is understood as easing the deceased's journey into the afterlife. But it also eases the living's journey into their new reality, a world without the person who died. The black cloth on the mirror is like a flag of truce, a temporary ceasefire in the battle to maintain normal appearances. For these days, we surrender to grief. We admit that we cannot function as we usually do. We allow the transformation to happen. The Scottish reverend who visited the Orkney Islands in 1773 and found that locals covered mirrors without knowing why was documenting something important. Traditions can outlast their explanations, can persist through sheer force of habit and cultural memory, even when the original reasons have been forgotten. This is not weakness but strength. The ability of human communities to maintain practices they sense are important even without full rational justification. We do this with many rituals. We blow out birthday candles without believing our wishes will come true, but we still make wishes. We throw rice at weddings without believing it ensures fertility, but we still throw it. We knock on wood without thinking it actually prevents bad luck, but we still knock. These gestures connect us to the past, to the accumulated experience of generations, to the wisdom embedded in tradition. The covered mirror is such a gesture. Even for those who don't believe in souls or spirits, there can be value in marking the significance of death through ritual action. The covering says, something has changed. We acknowledge this change. We honor it with deliberate transformation of our environment. In modern times, the practice has largely faded. Most funeral homes handle bodies quickly and efficiently, removing them from the home within hours of death. The deceased rarely lies in state in the family parlor anymore. Wakes are brief clinical affairs. Mourning has been privatized, compressed, made as unobtrusive as possible so that life can quickly return to normal. There is something lost in this efficiency, this rush to restore ordinary function. The old practices, for all their strangeness, acknowledged that death deserves time and space, that grief cannot be hurried, that the passage from life to death to memory requires ceremony and consciousness. When mirrors are covered, time slows down, the house becomes different. The mourners are given permission to exist outside normal expectations, to be raw and broken and focused entirely on their loss. This is increasingly rare in modern life, where people are expected to return to work within days, to resume normal functioning almost immediately, to grieve privately and quickly so as not to burden others. Perhaps this is why, when the practice does occur, when someone still remembers to cover the mirrors, still insists on observing the old customs, it can feel so powerful. It creates a pocket of sacred time, the deliberate separation from the relentless demands of contemporary life. For a week, for 3 days, for whatever period the tradition prescribes, the normal rules are suspended, the mirrors stay covered, the grief is given space. And then comes the moment of uncovering. Someone, often the eldest son, or a respected family member, or simply whoever feels called to do it, walks through the house removing the cloths. Maybe they fold them carefully, storing them away for the next time death visits. Maybe they launder them immediately, washing away the associations with grief and loss. Maybe they simply bundle them up and forget about them in a closet somewhere. The mirrors are revealed. You walk past and catch your reflection unexpectedly. There you are again, that familiar face. But something has shifted. You have lived through days without seeing yourself. Days focused entirely on absence and memory and the impossible fact of death. Now you must re-enter the world where appearances matter, where you check your hair before leaving the house, where you meet your own eyes in the bathroom mirror each morning. Some people report that this transition is jarring, almost painful. Others find it oddly comforting, a sign that life continues, that they are still here, still visible, still participating in the ordinary rituals of daily existence. The mirror, once a threshold to danger, becomes again just a mirror, a tool for grooming, for vanity, for the small confirmations of self that structure our days. But perhaps, for those who have covered mirrors and then uncovered them, the mirror never quite becomes ordinary again. Perhaps there remains a trace of the sacred, a memory of those days when it was draped and dark, when it marked the boundary between normal life and the strange country of grief. Perhaps every subsequent glance in a mirror carries with it the faintest echo. Remember what you learned when you could not see yourself. Remember what mattered when appearance meant nothing. Remember, tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is draping a mirror with dark cloth. The gesture is ancient. The hands are modern, but the impulse remains the same. When death visits, the mirrors must be hidden. Perhaps it is happening in a Jewish home in Brooklyn, where the family prepares for Shiva, where cousins arrive from distant cities and someone asks why the mirrors are covered and receives 3 different answers, all of them true. Perhaps it is in a Chinese apartment in Singapore, where an elderly woman insists that the mirrors be turned to the wall despite her children's protests that such beliefs are outdated, superstitious, unnecessary in this gleaming modern city. Perhaps it is in a house in rural Mississippi, where a great-grandmother who learned the custom from her own grandmother covers the mirrors, because it's what you do, because some traditions deserve preservation even when their meanings have grown unclear. Or perhaps it is in Italy, in Ireland, in Russia, in any of the countless places where this practice has taken root over centuries and millennia. The reasons given will vary: protection of the wandering soul, avoidance of vanity during mourning, fear of evil spirits, respect for prayer, cultural tradition, family custom. The specific explanation matters less than the act itself. The recognition that death requires ritual, that grief needs marking, that the boundary between this world and whatever comes next deserves acknowledgement. We live in an age that claims to have explained away mystery. We know that mirrors work through the reflection of light off metallic surfaces. We understand that death is the cessation of biological function, the end of consciousness as neurons cease firing. We have CAT scans and cardiac monitors and clear definitions of when life ends. We do not need superstition to explain what science has made plain. And yet people still report feeling something when they cover mirrors after a death. The house feels different. The atmosphere shifts. Something that cannot be measured or quantified, nevertheless changes when reflective surfaces are hidden away. Call it psychology, call it the power of ritual, call it collective unconscious or cultural memory, or simply the weight of tradition. Call it what you will, it remains. The skeptic in us says there are no souls to trap, no demons to see in reflections, no spiritual danger in an uncovered mirror. The mirror is just glass and silver photons bouncing at predictable angles, physics so well understood that we teach it to children. Death is tragic but natural, a biological inevitability with no supernatural component. But the part of us that dreams, that responds to symbol and story, that feels the hair rise on the back of the neck when entering a room where someone has recently died, that part is less certain. That part remembers ancestral wisdom, intuitive knowledge that exists below the level of language. That part suspects our ancestors were not fools, that their beliefs emerged from centuries of observation and experience, that dismissing them as mere superstition might mean losing something valuable. What if the truth is both and neither? What if covering mirrors serves a function that has nothing to do with literal souls or demons, but everything to do with creating psychological and emotional space for grief? What if our ancestors, lacking our vocabulary of psychology and neuroscience, expressed profound truths about the human experience of loss in the language of spirits and supernatural forces? The covered mirror says, you are in a liminal space now, a threshold between what was and what will be. The covered mirror says, focus inward rather than outward, on memory rather than appearance, on what endures rather than what fades. The covered mirror says, death has transformed your reality, and your environment should reflect that transformation. These messages remain valid regardless of whether one believes in literal soul entrapment. The ritual works, not through magic but through meaning, through the human capacity to use physical actions to mark psychological transitions, to embody abstract concepts in concrete gestures. Perhaps this is why the practice persists even as specific beliefs about souls and spirits decline. People may not literally fear that their deceased grandmother will become trapped in the bathroom mirror, but they still sense that covering that mirror serves a purpose, creates a different kind of space, honors the magnitude of what has occurred. In Jewish communities, the practice continues strongest, codified into mourning law, explained by rabbis, observed even by families who are not particularly religious the rest of the year. When death comes, they cover the mirrors because it is what Jews do, because the practice connects them to generations of ancestors, because the ritual provides structure during chaos. In Chinese families, particularly traditional ones, the mirrors still come down when someone dies. The statues of gods are still veiled in red paper. The old customs maintain their hold even in ultramodern cities, even among people who would laugh at superstition in other contexts. When death visits, the old ways resurface. In the American South, the practice has mostly faded, but it lingers in family stories, in the memories of great-aunts who still remember, in occasional flickers of observance when someone old enough to recall the tradition insists it be followed. The knowledge exists in pockets, preserved by people who feel it matters even if they cannot fully explain why. The Victorian mourning houses are gone, those elaborately draped parlours with their stopped clocks and covered mirrors. We do not mourn like that anymore, do not sequester ourselves for years in black bombazine and widow's weeds. But the impulse remains, the need to mark death as significant, to transform ordinary space into sacred space, to create rituals that help us navigate the impossible transition from life with someone to life without them. What we have learned tracing this practice across cultures and centuries is that human beings everywhere have understood mirrors as somehow special, somehow connected to the soul or self or spirit in ways that make them dangerous in the presence of death. The specific mechanics of that danger vary. Trapped souls, invading demons, bad luck, distraction from proper mourning, but the underlying intuition remains constant. We have also learned that rituals need not be believed literally to be practiced meaningfully. The agnostic who covers mirrors might not believe her mother's soul could become trapped, but she covers them anyway because the act helps her grieve, creates the psychological space she needs, honors both the deceased and the generations of ancestors who followed this custom before her. And we have learned that mystery persists. Despite our science, despite our explanations, there remains something inexplicable about death, something that resists our attempts to fully understand or control it. The covered mirror acknowledges this mystery. It says, "There are things we do not know, cannot know, perhaps should not try to know. Somewhere tonight, the cloth is being draped. Somewhere tomorrow, it will be removed." The practice continues, evolving and adapting, changing with the times, yet maintaining its essential nature. As long as people die and those who love them grieve, there will be rituals to mark the passage, to honor the dead, to protect or comfort the living. The mirror remains covered for now, dark and secret beneath its draping. What it would show if uncovered, a wandering soul, a demon's reflection, merely our own grief-marked faces, we cannot say with certainty. And perhaps that uncertainty is the point. Perhaps the covered mirror teaches us to live with mystery, to accept that some questions have no definitive answers, to trust in practices whose meanings shift and shimmer like light on water. When the cloth finally comes down, the house will return to its ordinary appearance. That those who covered the mirrors and lived for a time without their reflections will carry the experience forward. They will remember those days of sacred separation, that time when the normal rules were suspended and grief was given space to breathe. And perhaps, just perhaps, they will look at mirrors differently afterward, not just as tools for vanity or decoration, but as thresholds, boundaries, places where worlds touch and the membrane between them grows thin. They will catch their own eyes in the glass and remember, I have lived without seeing myself. I have passed through grief's dark country. I have covered the mirrors and uncovered them again, and I am changed. The tradition continues, carried forward by hands both old and young, preserved in the muscle memory of communities, passed down through generations in whispers and examples. As long as we fear death or honor the dead or simply feel that some moments deserve marking with ritual and reverence, the mirrors will be covered when death visits, and the mystery, beautiful, terrible, inexplicable, will remain.